you got to remember that this was a funny sort of Victorian war. It was a throwback. It was a very short war. It's nothing. Nowadays, we've been much more experienced with war because of Afghanistan and Iraq, and now, of course, Ukraine. There'd been very little conflict other than Northern Ireland internationally then. So it was for the British a novelty. And for the 70-odd days of the war, it completely absorbed the country back here.
Now, tomorrow marks 40 years since Argentina invaded and occupied the Falklands Islands. Britain has ruled, in inverted commas, the small island in the South Atlantic since 1833. But Argentina still maintains its claim to them to this day. Well, Falkland Islands generally prefer to stay British. They voted on it as well. Well, Margaret Thatcher's argument when she announced Britain would engage in Argentina in a war over the sovereignty of the islands to the House of Commons sounded like this.
When he left the Falklands, he said the people were in tears. They do not want to be Argentine. He said the islanders are still tremendously loyal. I must say that I have every confidence in the governor and the action he took. I must tell the House that the Falkland Islands and their dependencies remain British territory. No aggression and no invasion can alter that simple fact. It is a government's objective to see that the islands are freed from occupation and are returned to British administration at the earliest possible moment.
That was Margaret Thatcher addressing the House of Commons as she sent British ships to the Falklands to try and reclaim them. Well, somebody who was on one of those ships is now the editor of The Times, John Witherow, and he joins me now.
Hi.
So you were sent on HMS Invincible to cover the Falklands War. How does that work? So let's go right, even before you sort of set foot on the ship. How does that happen? How do you, as a reporter, get on one of the actual ships being sent?
Well, before I answer that, Matt, I'd just like to say I went to see your show at the Bloomsbury Theatre last night, and it was really good, really
good.
funny.
Phew,
and if anybody hasn't seen it, I recommend you go, because it's 2 hours of fantastic entertainment, although you end up despairing about our political leaders of all parties.
Of all parties. It's pretty equal opportunities.
So if I rewind my mind back 40 years, the first thing we did when we heard about this invasion was got out an atlas to find where the Falklands were. And then the head of news at the Times looked around the newsroom and decided he had to send somebody who was single. He didn't want anybody who was married, because he said we're going to get calls every day from the wives or husbands of whoever we send. So it has to be single. So that was me, because I think most of them were married. And it all happened incredibly quickly. I think the invasion was something like Thursday night and Friday. And I was on HMS Invincible by Sunday.
Wow.
So we had almost no time. Rushed home, gathered our kit, and got on HMS Invincible. And people were coming in from all over the country. Sailors were arriving with skis. They'd just broken off skiing holidays. It was all done in a rush. What I've got to say is I was the William Boot. For those who've read Scoop, I was the William Boot of the Times on the Falklands. They didn't really expect there to be a war, so they said, we can send Witherow. They'll all negotiate something at the UN, and then the ships will turn around and come back. But of course, as soon as we're going down the channel, the captain of HMS Invincible was a very impressive man called J.J. Black. And he said, I am convinced there's going to be a war. I do not think the Argentines will back down, and nor will Mrs. Thatcher. And we all went, oh, okay. War, is it?
That wasn't what you signed up for.
No. Although, I mean, the other thing, none of us amongst the reporters really knew much about the military, because obviously we were too young for national service. The most experience we probably had was in the Corps at school. And so we had to learn very fast about weapon systems, about how the Navy worked, how it interacted with the Naval Air Force. All these things we had to learn, but it became pretty apparent to us quickly that these ships were heavily undefended. As we went to Ascension Island, they started strapping machine guns on the side of HMS Invincible. And we would say, well, why have you got machine guns? What are they going to stop? And they say, it's for the sea-skimming missiles. And we said, I don't think, little that we know, I don't think that's going to stop an Exocet. And because they had no defences. And the idea was that the frigates on the horizon would defend Invincible, but they too didn't have the weapon systems. And you could see over years of bad procurement how they got the wrong weapon systems for this sort of war. So, I mean, the Exocets were a real threat as we went down, and obviously south of Ascension, HMS Sheffield was hit by an
Yeah.
Exocet. That Exocet was aimed at Invincible, and basically Sheffield was there to take the blow rather than the aircraft carrier, because losing either of the carriers, there were two of them, would have been a catastrophe and probably would have meant we lost the war.
And what was going through your mind then? Were you frightened, gung-ho, oblivious to what was going on?
Look, in all wars, they say long periods of tedium unified with periods of intense fear. At times it was scary. I mean, the Exocet was scary. There was a constant threat of submarine attack, and the Royal Navy was much better protected against submarines because that's what they trained for within NATO. And they had a lot of helicopters dipping probes into the water. Off Ascension, they went to battle stations because they thought an Argentine submarine was there. Unfortunately, they depth charged a whale. Because that was what they thought was a sub. So that's as we progressed south, the weather became a big issue. It was very rough. It was hard going. And then we transferred ashore and we were taken into San Carlos water, known as Bomb Alley. And it was so chaotic. We were put ashore in our blue Navy gear, carrying suitcases into this sort of conflict zone. We ended up in a sheep shed. We were taken off the sheep shed, shoved on an ammunition ship in San Carlos water, where we could see the Argentine planes coming in very low, and actually seemed quite slow because at low altitude they're not going that fast. And you could actually see the pilots' faces, intense concentration as they lined up to bomb the ships, coming into a hail of machine gun fire from all the ships. And bombs were going off. I mean, the bomb went off our ammunition ship just 50 meters away in the water. So I said to one of the guys, I need a life jacket. And he said, you don't want a life jacket, mate, you want a parachute. So we weren't comfortable on the ammunition ship, and we had to get off that a couple of days. And then we went ashore and became part of 5 Brigade, which was the latter part. And that led round to the worst incident of the war, in a sense, for the British, which was Bluff Cove, when Sir Galahad was hit. And I was there when the bombers came in, the Skyhawks, hit Sir Galahad, flew over our heads, and then we were there as the terrible injuries came ashore, the Welsh Guards, from the bombing of the ship.
And because you weren't serving, you were there to report. How did you get your stories back to London? And did the MOD have any, because you're there, you're literally wearing the uniform, did the MOD have any control over what you're reporting back?
They certainly did, and they were really difficult to deal with. I mean, our dispatches got immensely delayed. They sat in London. A lot of the copy was pooled. It was shared by everybody. It sat in London for days. The communications for the press were a disaster, actually. And we could have reported the war much better if they'd made us more of a priority, which they didn't. Because really, they didn't want us there. Thatcher had insisted the media go, but the military didn't want.
Oh, that's it. So she wanted you there.
Yeah.
It was a weird thing as well, wasn't it? Because in terms of getting the news back, I mean, it would take weeks, and even photos. It was a sort of a weird, the way it was reported by the papers back here, without almost any pictures.
Yeah. I mean, you have to look at the papers then. It was pretty archaic, and obviously it was black and white pictures. TV did quite well on the way down. If you think of Brian Hanrahan,
Yeah.
I counted them all out, I counted them all back, which reassured people that the planes were safe. But on land, the TV had a hard time, as did the press. And we tried to hand to helicopter pilots our copy, which we sort of scribbled out by hand, because you're living rough out there, and hoped that they'd take it to communications. So often they didn't. They just
Amazing.
disappeared.
It's just living out of people's hands. And how is the Times going to be marking the anniversary this weekend?
Well, we got extensive coverage, particularly online, with commemorating it, going back to some of the coverage of the time, and encouraging people to mark it, because it is a significant moment. You've got to remember that this was a funny sort of Victorian war. It was a throwback. It was a very short war. It's nothing. Nowadays, we've been much more experienced with war because of Afghanistan and Iraq, and now, of course, Ukraine. There'd been very little conflict other than Northern Ireland internationally then. So it was, for the British, a novelty. And for the 70-odd days of the war, it completely absorbed the country back here.
And do you miss being a war reporter? Do you ever fancy getting out of the editor's office and back on the front line?
As I say, William Boots now, I wasn't suited to it. I did do a bit in Afghanistan and Iraq, but No, I prefer being in the office.
You and me both. John, it's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming in and sharing your moments. That's John Witherow, the editor of The Times and the boss. So all on best behaviour, please. John, really good to see you. Thanks very much. Up next, we'll have Hugo Rifkin here telling us what he's got coming up on his show. Rifkin's Rewind is next.